Samuel Hayes found the grave at dawn, carved fresh into the red clay of Widow's Ridge, like a wound in the earth. The wooden cross bore his wife's name, Eleanor Hayes, 1842-1871, burned deep into pine with a steady hand. Wild flowers lay scattered across the mound, still heavy with morning dew, and beside the headstone sat a leather pouch containing Eleanor's wedding ring, her mother's pearl earrings, and a folded letter that would haunt him for the rest of his days. The black drifter who'd helped him search for Eleanor through 3 desperate nights had vanished without a word, leaving only this, a proper Christian burial for the woman Samuel had failed to protect, and answers to questions he'd been too afraid to ask. When Samuel opened that letter and read Eleanor's confession, written in her own careful script the day before she died, he finally understood why the stranger had looked at him with such knowing sadness, and why some secrets are buried deeper than bodies. But to understand how a Texas rancher came to kneel beside his wife's grave, grateful to a man whose name he'd never learned, we need to go back to where it started, 3 days earlier, when Eleanor Hayes walked out of their ranch house and into the storm that would claim her life. The morning Eleanor disappeared, she'd been humming. Samuel remembered that detail later, how the melody drifted from the kitchen window as he worked the fence line, some church hymn their preacher's wife had taught her. Amazing Grace, maybe, or one of those old spirituals that made Eleanor's voice catch with emotion she never could explain. By noon the humming had stopped. Samuel came in for dinner to find the house empty, Eleanor's sewing basket overturned on the parlor floor, her thimble rolled under the settee like a silver tear. The back door hung open, banging against the frame in the rising wind. Her Sunday dress was gone from the wardrobe, along with her good boots and the small carpet bag she'd brought from Virginia when they married. Eleanor, his voice echoed through rooms that suddenly felt too large, too quiet. Eleanor, you. The silence that answered him carried the weight of 29 years of marriage, of shared mornings and whispered conversations, of a love that had grown comfortable enough to take for granted. Samuel Hayes was a practical man, steady as the land he worked, but standing in that empty kitchen with Eleanor's coffee cup still warm on the table, he felt something crack open inside his chest. Outside, storm clouds were building over the Brazos Valley, purple, black, and heavy with the kind of rain that could turn creek beds into rivers and wash away anything foolish enough to get caught in the open. Eleanor knew these storms. She'd lived through enough Texas weather to respect what the sky could do when it set its mind to destruction. She wouldn't have left voluntarily, not in this weather, not without a word. Samuel saddled his horse and rode toward town, checking every path Eleanor might have taken, calling her name until his throat went raw. The wind swallowed his voice and threw it back twisted, full of mockery. At the general store, Mrs. Patterson shook her head, hadn't seen Eleanor all week. The postmaster said the same, even old Doc Morrison, who treated Eleanor's headaches with his patent medicines and kind words, could offer nothing but worried sympathy. Storm's getting worse, Samuel, Doc said, glancing at the darkening sky. Maybe Eleanor took shelter somewhere. You know how she is about lightning. Samuel knew. Eleanor had been afraid of storms since childhood. Something about being caught in a tornado back in Virginia. During bad weather she'd sit in the root cellar with her Bible and a lamp, reading scripture until the thunder passed. But the root cellar was empty, and her Bible was still on the bedroom nightstand. By evening, the storm hit with the fury of something personal. Rain lashed the ranch house windows, and wind howled through the gaps in the barn walls like voices of the dead. Samuel sat at his kitchen table, Eleanor's cold coffee growing a skin in the cup before him, and tried to make sense of a world where his wife could simply vanish. That's when he heard the knock. 3 deliberate raps on the front door, steady and patient despite the chaos outside. Samuel grabbed his rifle, habit more than fear, and opened the door to find a black man standing on his porch, tall and lean, maybe 40 years old, with a kind of weathered face that spoke of hard miles and harder choices. His clothes were travel-worn but clean, his hat pulled low against the rain. Evening, the stranger said. His voice carried the measured cadence of education, unusual for a drifter. Name's Isaiah. Heard in town you're missing your wife. Samuel studied the man's face, looking for deception or threat, and finding neither. You know something about Eleanor? No, sir, but I know about looking for people, and I know these hills. Isaiah nodded toward the storm-lashed darkness. Been tracking through this country for 3 days. Saw signs of passage on the ridge road, heading toward the breaks. In this weather, storm hit sudden like, could have caught someone in the open. Isaiah's eyes were steady, honest. I'd like to help, if you'll have me. Any other time Samuel might have hesitated. Texas in 1871 was a complicated place for a black drifter, especially one who spoke like he'd seen the inside of a schoolhouse. But Eleanor was somewhere out in that storm, and this stranger was offering to help find her. Why? Samuel. Isaiah was quiet for a long moment, rain dripping from the brim of his hat. Lost someone once myself. Know how it feels. Something in the man's voice convinced Samuel. He stepped aside, letting Isaiah into the warmth of the house. Coffee's hot. We'll start searching at first light. Obliged. Isaiah hung his hat on the peg by the door, and Samuel noticed the care with which he moved, the way he waited to be invited to sit. A man accustomed to reading rooms and situations, to knowing where he was and wasn't welcome. They sat at the kitchen table, 2 men bound by worry and the sound of rain on the roof. Isaiah drank his coffee black and listened as Samuel talked about Eleanor, how they'd met in Virginia before the war, how she'd followed him to Texas, despite her family's objections, how she'd made this wild country feel like home. She's a strong woman, Samuel said, staring into his cup. Stronger than she looks, but she's been different lately. Quieter. Sometimes I'd catch her staring out at the hills like she was seeing something I couldn't. Isaiah nodded. Country like this can weigh heavy on a person. All that space, all that silence, makes folks think about things they'd rather leave buried. You talk like you know. I know. Isaiah set down his cup. Also know that worrying won't bring her back safe, but looking might. They spent the rest of the night planning their search, spreading Samuel's hand-drawn maps across the table and marking likely routes Eleanor might have taken. Isaiah proved to have an impressive knowledge of the local terrain, every creek, every game trail, every place a person might seek shelter or lose their way. You've been through this country before, Samuel observed. Some, Isaiah said, traveled through during the war, came back after. Looking for someone, Isaiah's hands stilled on the map. Something like that. When dawn broke gray and watery over the soaked landscape, they rode out together. Samuel on his reliable bay gelding, Isaiah on a paint horse that looked as travel-seasoned as its rider. The storm had passed, leaving the world washed clean and strangely quiet. They found Eleanor's first trace 3 miles from the house. A piece of her dress caught on a mesquite thorn, blue cotton bright against the gray wood. The fabric was torn, not cut, and it hung at shoulder height. She was running, Isaiah said, studying the snag, or being blown by the wind. Either way, she was heading toward the break. They followed the ridge road deeper into the hill country, past landmarks Samuel knew by heart. The lightning-split oak where he'd proposed to Eleanor, the spring where they'd picnicked on their first anniversary, the overlook where she liked to sit and watch the sunset paint the valley gold. It was Isaiah who spotted the second sign, a partial boot print in a patch of mud beside Willow Creek, nearly washed away by the rain. The print was small, narrow, a woman's boot, good quality leather. She made it this far, Samuel said, hope and fear warring in his chest. That's something. Isaiah knelt beside the print, studying the depth and angle. She was tired. See how the heel dug in. She was favoring her left foot. They pressed on, following a trail only Isaiah seemed able to read. A broken branch here, a disturbed stone there. Signs so subtle Samuel would have missed them entirely. The man had skills that went beyond casual familiarity with the country. You track people for a living? Samuel asked as they navigated a steep switchback. I track things that need finding, Isaiah replied. Sometimes they're people. The trail led them higher into the hills, toward country Samuel rarely visited. Rough, broken land where the creek beds ran dry in summer, and flash floods carved new channels every spring. It was beautiful in its own harsh way, but unforgiving. Not a place to be caught alone in a storm. They found Eleanor's carpet bag first, wedged between 2 boulders at the bottom of a wash. The leather was water-stained, but intact, and inside Samuel found her Sunday dress, carefully folded, along with a few personal items, and something that made his blood run cold, a bundle of letters tied with a faded ribbon. Samuel recognized the paper, the careful handwriting. They were letters he'd written to Eleanor during the war, when he was fighting with Hood's Texas Brigade and she was waiting for him back in Virginia. Love letters, full of promises about the life they'd build together when the fighting ended. But there was another set of letters underneath, written in a different hand, a man's handwriting, strong and educated, addressed to my dearest Eleanor. Samuel's hands shook as he untied the ribbon. The first letter was dated 6 months ago, the last just 2 weeks. They were signed with a single initial I. Mr. Hayes. Isaiah's voice was gentle but urgent. Best you save the reading for later. We need to keep moving while we have light. Samuel looked up to find the drifter watching him with something that might have been sympathy. You knew about these letters. It wasn't a question. Isaiah nodded slowly. Figured you'd find them eventually. Question is, what are you going to do about it? Samuel stared at the letters in his hands, evidence of a betrayal that explained Eleanor's recent distance, her long silences, the way she'd stopped meeting his eyes across the dinner table. Part of him wanted to read every word, to understand how 29 years of marriage had come to this. Another part wanted to throw the letters into the creek and pretend they'd never existed. Instead, he folded them carefully and slipped them into his coat pocket. I'm going to find my wife. They climbed higher, following the wash toward its source in a narrow canyon. Isaiah called Devil's Throat. The walls rose steep on both sides, carved smooth by centuries of flash floods, and the air grew cooler as they ascended. Somewhere up ahead, water trickled over stone, not the rush of the creek, but something smaller, more intimate. Isaiah held up a hand, signaling silence. He'd gone very still, his head cocked to one side like a man listening to sounds only he could hear. When he looked back at Samuel, his expression was grim. She's up ahead, he said quietly. But Mr. Hayes, you need to prepare yourself. They left the horses at the mouth of the canyon and climbed on foot, following the sound of water over increasingly rough ground. The walls closed in around them, blocking out most of the sky, and Samuel felt the weight of stone and shadow pressing down like a premonition. They found Eleanor, at the base of a small waterfall, where the creek pooled in a natural basin, surrounded by smooth red rock. She lay on her side as if sleeping, still wearing her chemise and petticoat, her dark hair spread like a fan across the stone. Her wedding dress hung from a nearby juniper, white silk, bright as a prayer flag in the canyon gloom. Samuel dropped to his knees beside her, his hands hovering over her still form as if touch might somehow undo what had already been done. Eleanor's face was peaceful, unmarked by violence or pain. She might have been napping in their garden on a Sunday afternoon. How? He whispered. Isaiah knelt on Eleanor's other side, his movements respectful, reverent. Heart, most likely. Sometimes people just let go. He touched 2 fingers to her throat, feeling for a pulse they both knew wouldn't be there. She's been gone since yesterday, maybe the night before. She came here on purpose, Mr. Hayes. This was her choice. Samuel stared at his wife's face, memorizing the curve of her cheek, the slight smile that played at the corners of her mouth. Even in death, Eleanor looked like she'd found some kind of peace. There's something else, Isaiah said gently. He reached into Eleanor's petticoat pocket and withdrew a folded paper. She left this for you. With trembling fingers, Samuel unfolded what would prove to be Eleanor's final letter, her confession, her apology, and her goodbye. As he read her careful script explaining the love affair that had torn her apart, the guilt that had poisoned her days, and her decision to spare them all the scandal of discovery, Isaiah quietly began gathering stones for her grave. The letter ended with words that would echo in Samuel's mind for the rest of his life. I loved you both, Samuel, and that love was my sin, and my salvation. Forgive me if you can, forget me if you must, but know that I go to my rest grateful for every moment of joy you gave me, and every moment of love I was able to give in return. When Samuel looked up from the letter, tears blurring his vision, Isaiah was already at work, carefully, respectfully preparing Eleanor's body for burial, his movements those of a man who understood the weight of such moments. You loved her too, Samuel said. It wasn't a question. Isaiah's hands stilled for a moment. Then he nodded. Yes, I did. How long? Since the war. I was passing through your county after Appomattox. She found me half dead in your creek bottom, nursed me back to health, while you were still making your way home from the surrender. Isaiah's voice was steady, but Samuel heard the pain beneath. Never meant for it to happen. Never meant for any of this to happen. They worked together in silence as the sun climbed toward noon. 2 men bound by love for the same woman, preparing her for her final rest. Isaiah had thought of everything. Tools for digging, cloth for wrapping, even the pine cross he carved with a folding knife whose blade gleamed with careful maintenance. As they laid Eleanor in the red earth of Widow's Ridge, Samuel found himself grateful for this stranger's presence, for hands that knew how to honor the dead and a heart that understood the weight of loss. When the last stone was placed and Isaiah stepped back from the completed grave, Samuel finally asked the question that had been building in his chest. "What's your full name?" "Isaiah Freeman," the drifter said. "Used to be Isaiah Washington, back when I belonged to someone else. Took the new name when I got my papers. Freeman." Samuel tested the sound of it, like the freedom, like the hope of it. Isaiah picked up his hat from where he'd set it on a nearby boulder. "I should be moving on. You've got grief to work through, and I've got places to..." Samuel looked at the man who'd helped him find his wife, who'd loved her and lost her and still found the grace to give her a proper burial. "Where will you go?" Isaiah settled the hat on his head and looked out over the valley spread below them, green and gold in the afternoon light. "North, maybe, or west. Doesn't much matter, long as it's away from here." "Isaiah." Samuel stood and extended his hand. "Thank you." They shook hands beside Eleanor's grave, two men who'd shared love and loss, and the kind of honesty that only comes in the shadow of death. Then Isaiah Freeman walked down the hill toward his paint horse, and Samuel Hayes knelt beside his wife's grave to begin the long work of learning to live with what he'd lost. But that wasn't the end of the story, because 3 days later, when Samuel returned to the grave with fresh flowers and a proper headstone, he would find something that would change everything he thought he understood about love, loss, and the mysteries that bind human hearts together across impossible distances. Part 2, The Letters That Changed Everything. 3 days after they buried Eleanor, Samuel returned to Widow's Ridge with a granite headstone he'd ordered from the stone cutter in town. The marble would have been prettier, but granite would last longer in the Texas weather, and Samuel wanted something that would endure. Eleanor deserved that much. He'd spent those 3 days in his empty house, drinking coffee that tasted like ashes, and reading the letters he'd found in Eleanor's carpetbag. The ones he'd written to her during the war were painful enough, full of young love and innocent promises about the future they'd build together. But Isaiah's letters were something else entirely. They weren't the crude propositions Samuel had expected from a man pursuing another man's wife. Instead, they read like conversations between two minds that had found their match. Isaiah wrote about books Eleanor had mentioned, poems she'd shared, questions about faith and freedom that had clearly occupied both their thoughts. He wrote about his childhood in slavery, his education at the hands of a sympathetic master's wife, his years as a scout for the Union Army after his escape. The letters painted a picture of a relationship that had grown slowly, carefully, built on respect and shared understanding rather than mere passion. Reading them, Samuel began to understand what had drawn Eleanor to Isaiah Freeman, not just his intelligence or his gentle manner, but the way he'd seen and valued parts of her that Samuel had never known existed. "You asked about my dreams," Isaiah had written in one letter. "I dream of a school, Eleanor, a place where children who look like me can learn to read and write and think about something bigger than the cotton they're born to pick. You said you dream of teaching. Maybe someday we can dream together." Samuel folded that letter with hands that shook only slightly. He was beginning to understand that Eleanor's betrayal wasn't simple adultery. It was the collision of two different kinds of love, and the terrible choice she'd felt forced to make between them. Now standing beside Eleanor's grave with the new headstone balanced against his shoulder, Samuel realized he wasn't alone. A small bouquet of wildflowers lay fresh on the mounded earth, Indian paintbrush and bluebonnets, arranged with the same care Isaiah had shown in preparing Eleanor's body for burial. Samuel set down the headstone and knelt to examine the flower. They'd been picked that morning, still heavy with dew. Someone had been here recently, paying respects to a woman they'd loved and lost. "Figured you might come back today." Samuel turned to find Isaiah emerging from the grove of live oaks that crowned the ridge. The drifter looked older somehow, worn down by grief and the weight of departing. His travel pack was slung over one shoulder, his bedroll tied behind it. He was leaving, just as he'd said he would. "Didn't expect to see you again," Samuel said, standing and brushing dirt from his knee. "Didn't expect to stay this long." Isaiah nodded toward the headstone. "That's a fine piece of stone. Eleanor would have liked it." They worked together to set the granite marker, digging out the proper depth, ensuring it stood straight and true. The inscription was simple: Eleanor Hayes, beloved wife, 1842. Samuel had thought about adding more, something about her kindness or her faith, but in the end, the simplicity felt right. Eleanor had been beloved, and that was enough. When the headstone was secure, Isaiah pulled something from his coat pocket, a leather-bound journal,
small enough to fit in a man's palm. Found this among Eleanor's things that first day. Thought you should have it. Samuel took the journal with careful hand. The leather was soft with age, and Eleanor's initials were stamped in gold on the cover. He'd never seen it before, though he recognized it as the type of diary fashionable women sometimes kept. "Did you read it?" he asked. "No, sir. Wasn't my place." Isaiah adjusted his pack, preparing to leave, but she wrote in it regular-like, right up until the end. Samuel opened the journal to a random page, and found Eleanor's familiar handwriting, dated just 2 weeks before her death. "Samuel brought me roses from the garden today, white ones, because he remembered they're my favorite." He looked so pleased with himself, so eager for my smile. How can I tell him that every kindness he shows me is like salt in a wound? How can I explain that his love has become a burden I can no longer bear? Samuel closed the journal quickly, the words hitting him like a physical blow. "She was in pain." "Yes," Isaiah said simply. "We both were. Love isn't supposed to hurt like that, but sometimes it does. Sometimes caring about someone means making choices that tear you apart." "Is that why she—" Samuel couldn't finish the sentence. "Eleanor was a good woman, Mr. Hay. Good women don't run away with other men, even when they want to, and they don't break up homes, even when staying breaks their own hearts." Isaiah looked out over the valley, his expression distant. "She chose what she thought was the honorable path. Death isn't honorable." Samuel struggled for words. "It's waste. Maybe, or maybe it was the only choice she could live with." Isaiah turned back to Samuel, and something in his expression had changed, become more direct, more urgent. "There's something else you need to know, something I should have told you before." Samuel waited, tension building in his chest. "Eleanor was with child," Isaiah said quietly. "Early yet, but she knew. That's why she couldn't keep living the lie, and why she couldn't bear to tell the truth." The words hit Samuel like a physical blow, driving the air from his lungs. He sat down hard on a nearby boulder, the journal clutched in his hands. "The baby, was it? Could have been either of ours," Isaiah said. "Eleanor didn't know, couldn't know, and the not knowing was killing her." Samuel stared at the fresh grave, understanding finally flooding through him like cold water. Eleanor's recent silences, her refusal to meet his eyes, the way she'd flinched when he tried to touch her. She'd been carrying a child that might not have been his, torn between two men she loved in different ways, seeing no path forward that didn't destroy someone she cared about. "So she chose to destroy herself instead," he whispered. "She chose to spare the rest of us," Isaiah corrected. "Eleanor always was stronger than either of us deserved." They stood in silence for a long moment, two men contemplating the grave of the woman who'd loved them both, and found that love too heavy to carry. Finally, Isaiah shouldered his pack again.
"I'll be going now," he said. "You won't see me in this country again." "Where will you go?" "North. There's a school in Kansas that needs teachers. Colored children learning to read and write." Isaiah smiled sadly. Eleanor would have liked that. Samuel stood and extended his hand. "Isaiah, I want you to know. I don't blame you for any of it." Isaiah took his hand, gripping it firmly. "Obliged. That means more than you know. And Isaiah, if you do start that school, name it for her. The Eleanor Hayes School. She would have wanted that." For the first time since Samuel had met him, Isaiah Freeman's composure cracked. Tears gathered in his eyes, though he didn't let them fall. "I'll do that. Yes, sir. I'll do that." They released hands and Isaiah walked away through the live oaks without looking back. Samuel listened to the sound of his footsteps fading, then the distant whinny of his horse, then nothing but wind through the trees. Samuel spent the rest of the afternoon reading Eleanor's journal, sitting beside her grave as the sun tracked across the sky. The entries painted a picture of a woman wrestling with impossible choices, torn between duty and desire, between the man she'd promised to love and the man who'd awakened parts of her she'd never known existed. "I am not the woman Samuel married," she'd written 3 months before her death. That girl died somewhere between Virginia and Texas, replaced by someone harder, lonelier, more desperate for connection. Samuel loves the memory of who I was. Isaiah loves who I've become. Neither love feels entirely real, because neither man knows the whole truth of me. The final entry was dated the day before she died. "I have made my choice. It is not the choice any of us would have wanted, but it is the only one that allows love to survive. Samuel will grieve, but he will heal. Isaiah will carry guilt, but he will build something beautiful in the world." and I will rest knowing that I spared them both the burden of choosing between love and honor. Perhaps that is enough. As the sun set over the Brazos Valley, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson, Samuel closed the journal and placed it on Eleanor's grave. He would take it home eventually, read it fully, try to understand the woman he'd thought he'd known completely. But for now, it belonged here. With her. Walking back to his horse in the gathering darkness, Samuel found himself thinking not about betrayal or loss, but about the strange grace that had brought Isaiah Freeman into his life at the moment he'd needed him most. A man who'd loved Eleanor enough to help her husband find her body. A man who'd cared enough to dig her grave and carve her headstone, and lay flowers on her resting place. Love, Samuel realized, wasn't always what you expected it to be. Sometimes it looked like fidelity and devotion. Sometimes it looked like passion and desperate yearning. And sometimes, if you were very lucky, it looked like a stranger, helping you bury your dead with dignity and respect. He mounted his horse and rode home through the Texas night, carrying Eleanor's secrets and Isaiah's sacrifice, beginning to understand that some stories don't have villains, only people trying to do right in a world that doesn't make right easy to find. But the story wasn't over, because 2 weeks later, Samuel would receive a letter that would challenge everything he thought he knew about Eleanor's final choice, and force him to confront a truth more complex and painful than anything he'd yet imagined. Part 3. The truth about Eleanor's choice. The letter arrived on a Tuesday, delivered by the same postal rider who'd brought Eleanor's correspondence from Isaiah all those months. Samuel almost didn't open it. The handwriting was unfamiliar, careful and feminine, and he'd had enough of surprises for one lifetime. But something about the return address caught his attention. Mrs. Catherine Morrison, Galveston, Texas. Eleanor had mentioned a Catherine once or twice, a school friend from Virginia who'd moved to the coast. Samuel had never met her, but Eleanor had spoken of her fondly, one of the few people who'd truly understood her restless mind and her hunger for something more than domestic quiet. Dear Hayes, the letter began. You do not know me, but I knew your wife Eleanor well. We corresponded regularly until her death, and I feel compelled to share something she told me in confidence, something that may help you understand her final choice. Samuel set the letter down and poured himself a whiskey. Outside, spring was coming to the hill country, wildflowers blooming in the meadows, new grass greening the hillsides. Eleanor would have loved this time of year, would have insisted they ride out together to see the bluebonnets in full flower. The thought of facing another Texas spring without her made his chest tight. He picked up the letter. Eleanor wrote to me about Isaiah Freeman, about the love that grew between them, and the impossible position it created. But she also wrote about something else, something I believe you deserve to know. Eleanor was not pregnant, Mr. Hayes. She told Freeman she was because she wanted him to leave, wanted to force a crisis that would end their relationship before it destroyed your marriage entirely. Samuel read the sentence twice, then 3 times, the words refusing to make sense. Eleanor hadn't been carrying a child. She'd lied to Isaiah about the pregnancy. She hoped that believing himself the father of her child would drive him away, that his honor would compel him to remove himself from a situation that could only bring scandal and pain. Eleanor understood Freeman well enough to know he would never willingly destroy another man's home. She gambled that the possibility of a child would force him to make the choice she couldn't bring herself to make. The letter continued, but Mr. Freeman surprised her. Instead of fleeing, he wrote to say he would stand by her whatever the consequences, that he would find a way to provide for her and the child without destroying your marriage. He spoke of going west together, starting fresh in California or Oregon territory where their past wouldn't matter. Eleanor realized then that she had misjudged both his character and his love, and that her lie had made their situation infinitely worse, not better. Samuel stood and walked to the window, staring out at the hills where Eleanor was buried. Everything Isaiah had told him about Eleanor's final days, the guilt, the impossible choice between honor and desire, the burden of carrying another man's child, had been built on a lie Eleanor herself had created. She wrote to me the day before she died. Catherine Morrison's letter continued. Eleanor said she had created a web of deception that was strangling everyone she loved. She could not tell you the truth about Isaiah without destroying your faith in her entirely. She could not tell Isaiah the truth about the pregnancy without revealing herself as a manipulative liar, and she could not continue living the lie without becoming someone she no longer recognized. I have painted myself into a corner, she wrote, and the only door out is the one I cannot bear to walk through, the one that leads to honesty and the destruction of every relationship that matters to me. Perhaps it is better to leave them with their illusions and take the truth with me to the grave. Samuel sank into his chair, the letter trembling in his hand. Eleanor's final choice hadn't been about sparing them the burden of an illegitimate child. It had been about sparing them the knowledge of her deception. She'd died to protect a lie she'd created to protect their heart. The letter concluded, I share this not to diminish your grief or to tarnish Eleanor's memory, but because I believe the living deserve the truth however painful it might be. Eleanor was not the saint you may remember, nor the simple adulteress some might paint her to be. She was a woman who made terrible choices in an attempt to preserve the love she valued above her own life. Whether that makes her foolish or noble I leave for you to decide. I remain, with deepest sympathy, Catherine Morrison. Samuel folded the letter carefully and placed it in the drawer with Eleanor's journal and Isaiah's correspondence. Then he sat in his empty house and tried to process what he'd learned. Eleanor had lied to Isaiah about the pregnancy to drive him away. When that strategy backfired, she'd found herself trapped by her own deception, unable to confess the lie without revealing her manipulation, unwilling to continue living a falsehood that was poisoning everyone she loved. She'd chosen death as the only escape from a web of her own making. And Isaiah, good, honorable Isaiah Freeman, had spent the last weeks of Eleanor's life, believing himself responsible for a child that had never existed, wrestling with guilt over a situation that had been built on false foundations from the start. Samuel thought about the man who'd helped him search for Eleanor, who'd worked beside him to dig her grave, who'd carried the burden of believing her death was partly his fault. Isaiah had left Texas convinced that his love for Eleanor had driven her to suicide, never knowing that she'd lied to manipulate him into leaving. Did he deserve to know the truth, or was Eleanor's secret better left buried with her? Samuel spent 3 days wrestling with the question. On the 4th day he saddled his horse and rode to town, where the postmaster confirmed that Isaiah Freeman had indeed been receiving mail at the general delivery window for several weeks before Eleanor's. No one knew where he'd gone, but the postmaster remembered him mentioning something about Kansas. It took Samuel another week of letter writing and telegraph messages to track down the Freedmen's School in Lawrence, Kansas. When he finally received confirmation that Isaiah Freeman was indeed teaching there, Samuel spent 2 more days composing a letter that would either bring peace or reopen wounds that were finally beginning to heal. Dear Mr. Freeman, I hope this letter finds you well, and that your work with the school brings you satisfaction. I write with information about Eleanor that you deserve to know, though I confess I am uncertain whether sharing it will prove a kindness or a cruelty. Samuel went on to explain Catherine Morrison's letter, Eleanor's deception about the pregnancy, and the real reasons behind her final choice. He tried to be gentle, to place Eleanor's lie in the context of her desperation and love, but there was no way to soften the central truth. She had manipulated Isaiah's feelings to try to force him away, then died rather than admit her deception. I do not share this to cause you pain, Samuel concluded, but because I believe you have been carrying guilt that rightfully belongs to Eleanor and to me. Her death was not your fault, Mr. Freeman. It was the consequence of choices she made in fear and desperation, choices that grew from a situation neither of us handled well. I hope you can find peace in this knowledge, as I am trying to do. Eleanor loved us both, in her way, and her love was both her greatest gift and her fatal flaw. Perhaps that is enough truth for any one life to bear. With respect and gratitude for your kindness during the darkest days of my life, Samuel Hayes. Samuel sealed the letter and rode to town to post it, knowing he might never receive a reply. Isaiah Freeman had shown him extraordinary grace in their brief acquaintance, but even grace had limits. Learning that Eleanor's pregnancy had been a lie, that her death had been motivated by deception rather than noble sacrifice, might be more than any man could forgive. 3 weeks later, Samuel's answer came in the form of a brief telegram. Truth received. Thank you. School named Eleanor Hayes Academy. She would approve. I, Freeman. Samuel read the telegram 3 times before the full weight of Isaiah's response hit him. The man had absorbed the news of Eleanor's deception, processed the complex truth of her motivations, and somehow found his way to forgiveness, not just of Eleanor, but of the situation that had destroyed them all. More than that, he'd kept his promise to name his school after Eleanor, even knowing now that she'd died protecting a lie rather than a noble sacrifice. It was a grace Samuel wasn't sure he could have shown in similar circumstance. That evening Samuel walked up to Widow's Ridge to visit Eleanor's grave for what he knew would be the last time in a long while. The wildflowers Isaiah had left were long dead, replaced now by the natural beauty of a Texas spring. Bluebonnets and Indian paintbrush carpeting the hillside, live oaks heavy with new leaves. Samuel knelt beside the granite headstone and placed his hand on the sun-warmed stone. "Well, Eleanor," he said quietly, "seems like your secrets are finally out." The wind sighed through the oak branches, and somewhere in the distance a mockingbird ran through its repertoire of borrowed song. Samuel found himself thinking about truth and lies, about the stories people tell themselves and each other to make life bearable. Eleanor had lied to Isaiah about the pregnancy, but she'd done it from love, misguided perhaps, but genuine. She'd died rather than face the consequences of her deception, but she'd also died believing she was sparing the men she loved from a scandal that would have destroyed them. Was her final choice cowardice or sacrifice? Samuel was no longer sure it mattered. What mattered was that she'd loved them both, that her love had created an impossible situation, and that she'd tried, however imperfectly, to find a solution that would preserve their honor if not her own. "I forgive you," Samuel said to the silent stone, "for all of it. The lies, the deception, the choice to leave us behind. I understand why you did it, and I forgive you." The words felt like a weight lifting from his shoulders, a burden he'd been carrying without realizing it. Eleanor was gone, her secrets exposed, her choices made and unmade. What remained was the memory of 29 years of marriage, the good along with the painful, and the knowledge that love, even complicated, imperfect love, was worth grieving for. Samuel stood and brushed the dirt from his knee. Tomorrow he would begin the work of building a life without Eleanor, of learning to be alone in a house that had been made for two. But tonight he felt something he hadn't experienced since finding Eleanor's body in the canyon, a sense of peace, hard-won and honest. Walking down the hill toward his waiting horse, Samuel thought about Isaiah Freeman standing in front of a classroom of freed slaves' children, teaching them to read and write under a sign that bore Eleanor Hayes' name. It was a better monument than any headstone, a living legacy that would outlast granite and gold. Perhaps that was how love was supposed to work. Not perfect, not without pain, but generative somehow, creating something beautiful even in the midst of loss. Eleanor's story was ending, but the school that bore her name would write new stories, teach new minds, plant seeds in soil that might have remained barren. Without her complicated legacy, that was enough, Samuel decided. It would have to be but the story had one more chapter to write, a final revelation that would arrive 6 months later and force Samuel to reconsider everything he thought he understood about the woman he'd married, and the choices she'd made in her final days. Part 4, The Man Who Knew Eleanor's Heart. 6 months after Eleanor's death, Samuel had settled into a routine that felt almost like living. He rose before dawn to tend the cattle, spent his mornings mending fences and maintaining the ranch, his afternoons in town conducting the business that kept body and soul together. Evenings he read by lamplight, sometimes Eleanor's journal, sometimes the books she'd loved, sometimes Isaiah's letters, trying to understand the woman who'd shared his life for nearly 3 decades. The grief hadn't left him, but it had changed, softened from the sharp edge of fresh loss to something more bearable. He'd learned to cook simple meals, to keep the house clean enough for a man living alone, to find small pleasures in solitude that he'd never imagined. When Eleanor filled the rooms with her presence, he was coming back from the south pasture on an October afternoon when he saw the buggy pulled up beside his front porch. A stranger sat waiting on his steps, an elderly black man with silver hair and the kind of dignified bearing that spoke of education and experience. The man's clothes were well made but travel-worn, and his lined face held an expression of patient determination. "Mr. Hayes," the stranger stood as Samuel dismounted. "My name is Josiah Washington. I wonder if I might have a word with you about Eleanor." Samuel studied the man's face, looking for some family resemblance to Isaiah Freeman. The surname was different, but Isaiah had mentioned changing his name when he gained his freedom. "You're kin to Isaiah Freeman. Isaiah Washington was my son before he became Isaiah Freeman." Josiah's voice carried the refined cadence of an educated man, but underneath lay the unmistakable weight of years spent in bondage. "I've come a long way to speak with you, Mr. Hayes, about Eleanor, and about truths that should have been told long ago." Samuel invited the old man inside, made coffee, and listened as Josiah Washington,
began to unravel the final mystery of Eleanor's story. "My son wrote to me before Eleanor's death," Josiah said, accepting a cup with hands that bore old scars from plantation work. He was troubled by the situation, torn between love and honor, afraid of the consequences his feelings might bring. "I counseled him to end the relationship, to remove himself from temptation before it destroyed innocent lives." "Sound advice," Samuel said carefully. "But I didn't know then what I know now." Josiah reached into his coat and withdrew a letter, the paper yellowed with age. "This came to me 3 days after Eleanor died, posted the day before she took her own life." Samuel accepted the letter with reluctant hand. Eleanor's handwriting flowed across the page in the careful script he knew so well, but the words she'd written were addressed to a stranger. "Dear Mr. Washington," the letter began, "you do not know me, but I am the woman who has brought such turmoil to your son's life. I write to you now because I have no one else who might understand the choice I am about to make, and because Isaiah deserves to have his father know the truth about the kind of woman who claimed to love him." The letter went on to detail Eleanor's deception about the pregnancy, her failed attempt to manipulate Isaiah into leaving, her growing desperation as the web of lies tightened around everyone she cared about. But it also revealed something Samuel had never suspected, the true depth of Eleanor's feelings for Isaiah, and the price she'd paid for loving 2 men simultaneously. "I am not the faithless wife Samuel would have cause to despise if he knew the whole truth," Eleanor had written. "Nor am I the helpless victim of passion that some might paint me to be. I am a woman who discovered too late that the heart is capable of holding more love than society allows it to express. I loved Samuel for his steadiness, his kindness, his ability to make me feel safe in a dangerous world. I love Isaiah for his mind, his courage, his vision of a future where love might matter more than the color of skin or the circumstances of birth. Neither love diminishes the other, yet the world insists I must choose between them. I find I cannot make that choice without destroying part of myself, and destroying both men in the process. So I choose a different path, the only path that preserves their honor and allows their love for me to remain pure and unspoiled by scandal." Samuel looked up from the letter to find Josiah watching him with sympathetic eyes. "She wrote to you because she needed someone to understand. She wrote to me because she knew I would tell my son the truth after she was gone," Josiah corrected gently. Eleanor understood that Isaiah would blame himself for her death if he believed she died carrying his child. She wanted him to know that her choice was hers alone, made from love rather than despair. "But she lied about the pregnancy," Samuel said. "We know that now." Josiah nodded slowly. "Yes, she lied, but not for the reasons you might think." He leaned forward in his chair. "Mr. Hayes, did you know that Eleanor had been trying to conceive for years, that she saw doctors in San Antonio and Austin, took treatments that made her sick, prayed until her knees were raw, all in hopes of giving you the child you both wanted?" Samuel felt the world tilt beneath him. Eleanor had never spoken of wanting children, had seemed content with their quiet life together. But now, thinking back, he remembered small signs, the way she'd grown quiet around other people's babies, her insistence on keeping the spare bedroom furnished as though expecting a guest, who never arrived. "The doctors told her it would never happen," Josiah continued. "Something about damage from a fever she'd had as a child. Eleanor believed herself to be barren, Mr. Hayes. When she told Isaiah she was pregnant, she wasn't just trying to drive him away. She was giving herself for one brief moment, the chance to experience what it felt like to carry life inside her body." The letter in Samuel's hands seemed to grow heavier. Eleanor's final deception hadn't been mere manipulation. It had been the desperate fantasy of a woman who'd never been able to give her husband the family they'd both wanted. She knew the lie would be discovered if Isaiah stayed, Josiah explained. Knew it would become another source of pain and betrayal. But for a few weeks, she allowed herself to imagine what it would feel like to be the mother she'd always wanted to be, even if that child existed only in her mind and in my son's letter. Samuel set down the letter and walked to the window, staring out at the hills where Eleanor was buried. Every revelation about his wife's final months seemed to peel away another layer of the woman he'd thought he'd known, revealing new depths of pain and complexity. "Why didn't she tell me?" he asked quietly. "About wanting children, about the doctors, about any of it." "Because she loved you too much to burden you with her grief," Josiah said simply. "Eleanor knew you would have blamed yourself, would have spent your life trying to fix something that couldn't be fixed. She chose to carry that pain alone rather than share it with you." Samuel turned back to face the old man. "And Isaiah, does he know all this now?" "He knows," I traveled to Kansas last month to tell him myself. Josiah's expression soft. My son is teaching 23 children to read and write in a school that bears Eleanor's name. He speaks of her every day, not with guilt or regret, but with gratitude for the love she shared with him, and the reminder she gave him that the heart is large enough to hold many kinds of caring. He's found peace with it then. He's found purpose in it, Josiah corrected. Isaiah understands now that Eleanor's love, complicated and painful as it was, helped make him the man he was meant to be. A man who can love deeply without possessing, who can carry loss without being destroyed by it, who can build something beautiful from the ashes of what was lost.
They sat in silence for a long moment. Two men contemplating the mystery of a woman who'd loved so deeply it had destroyed her. Finally, Josiah spoke again. There's one more thing, Mr. Hayes. Something Eleanor asked me to give you if I ever had the chance. He reached into his coat and withdrew a small wooden box, polished smooth by handling. Inside, nestled in faded silk, was a gold locket Samuel had never seen before. She bought this in San Antonio 3 years ago, Josiah explained. Had a miniature painted from that daguerreotype you had made for your 20th anniversary. She wore it when she met with Isaiah, when she wanted to feel your presence even while loving another man. Samuel opened the locket to find his own face staring back at him, younger and more hopeful than he remembered being. Opposite the miniature was a tiny lock of Eleanor's hair, dark brown shot through with premature silver. She wanted you to know that even when she was with him, part of her heart remained with you, Josiah said softly. That her love for Isaiah never diminished what she felt for you. It only showed her how much love one heart can hold. Samuel closed the locket and held it tight in his palm, feeling the weight of gold and memory, and 29 years of marriage distilled into this small token. Eleanor had carried his picture with her to her meetings with Isaiah, had died wearing another man's love, while keeping her husband's image close to her heart. Thank you, he said, his voice rough with emotion, for bringing this, for helping me understand. Josiah stood and gathered his hand. Eleanor was a rare woman, Mr. Hayes, flawed as we all are, but capable of a kind of love most people never experience. She deserved better than the choices life offered her. She deserved to live, Samuel said. Yes, Josiah agreed, but since she chose otherwise, she deserves to be remembered for who she truly was, not the saint or sinner others might make of her, but a woman who loved deeply and paid the price for that love with her life. After Josiah Washington left, Samuel sat at his kitchen table and read Eleanor's final letter 3 more times. Each reading revealed new layers of pain and love, new understanding of the woman who'd shared his life and carried secrets he'd never suspected. As the sun set over the Brazos Valley, Samuel made his decision. He would ride to Widow's Ridge one more time, not to say goodbye but to say thank you to the woman who'd loved him steadily for 29 years, to the part of her heart that had remained his even while the rest of it reached towards something he couldn't provide, to the mystery of a love large enough to encompass contradictions that would have destroyed a smaller spirit. Eleanor's story was finally complete, all secrets revealed, all truths acknowledged. What remained was the work of living with those truths, of honoring her memory, not by pretending she was perfect, but by accepting the full complexity of who she'd been. Samuel slipped the locket chain around his neck, feeling Eleanor's miniature rest against his heart. Tomorrow he would begin building a new kind of life, one informed by loss, but not defined by it, one that honored the past while remaining open to whatever future might unfold. But tonight, he would ride to Eleanor's grave and tell her that he finally understood, that he forgave her for the secrets and the lies and the love that had been too large for any one life to contain. Some stories end with resolution, others end with acceptance. Samuel Hayes was learning the difference, and finding that acceptance, while harder won, offered deeper peace than resolution ever could. Part 5. The Letter That Never Came. 5 years after Eleanor's death, Samuel Hayes had built what most people would call a good life. His ranch prospered, his cattle were known throughout the county for their quality, and he'd earned the respect of his neighbors as a man who kept his word and minded his own business. He'd even begun accepting dinner invitations from the widow Patterson, whose cooking reminded him that food could be about more than mere sustenance. But every spring, when the wildflowers bloomed on Widow's Ridge, Samuel would ride up to Eleanor's grave and spend an afternoon in conversation with the woman who'd taught him that love was more complicated than he'd ever imagined. He'd tell her about the ranch, about the changes in the county, about the letter he received each Christmas from the Eleanor Hayes Academy in Kansas, where Isaiah Freeman now served as headmaster to more than 100 students. It was during one of these visits, on a warm April day in 1876, that Samuel found someone waiting for him at Eleanor's grave. The man was young, maybe 25, with Isaiah Freeman's intelligent eyes and Josiah Washington's dignified bearing. He knelt beside Eleanor's headstone, arranging fresh wildflowers with careful hands. "Mr. Hayes," the young man stood as Samuel approached. "I hoped I might find you here. My name is Daniel Freeman. I'm Isaiah's." Samuel studied the young man's face, seeing echoes of the drifter who'd helped him bury his wife 5 years earlier. Didn't know Isaiah had family. Born free in Kansas, after he started the school. Daniel's smile was warm but respectful. "My father told me about Eleanor, about what happened here. I've been wanting to meet you for a long time." They stood together beside Eleanor's grave, two men separated by a generation and bound by the memory of someone they'd both loved at a distance. Daniel had his father's careful way of speaking, but there was something more direct in his manner, the confidence of a man who'd never known slavery. "How is Isaiah?" Samuel asked. "Teaching still. The school has grown to serve 3 counties now. We have students traveling 50 miles to attend classes." Daniel's pride in his father's work was evident. He speaks of Eleanor often, says she taught him that education isn't just about books and letters, but about opening the mind to possibilities you never knew existed. Samuel nodded. She would have liked that. Eleanor always believed in the power of learning. "There's something else, Mr. Something my father wanted you to know, but never found the words to tell you." Daniel reached into his coat and withdrew a letter, the envelope yellow with age. "Eleanor wrote this the day before she died. It was meant for you, but she gave it to my father and asked him to decide whether you should ever see it." Samuel's hands trembled as he accepted the letter. After 5 years of thinking Eleanor's story was complete, here was one final revelation. "Why now?" "My father is dying, Mr. Hayes. Consumption. He wants all debts settled, all truths told before he meets his maker." Daniel's voice was steady, but Samuel could see the grief in his young eyes. "He said you deserved to know what Eleanor really wanted to say to you at the end." Samuel broke the seal with careful fingers and unfolded the letter. Eleanor's handwriting was shakier than usual, written in haste or under great emotion. "My dearest Samuel, if you are reading this, then Isaiah has chosen to share what I asked him to keep secret. Perhaps that is for the best. We have had too many secrets between us already. I want you to know that every morning for 29 years, I woke up grateful to be your wife, not because you were perfect, neither of us was that, but because you made me feel safe in a world that seemed designed to tear gentle things apart, because you loved me steadily, without drama or conditions, in the quiet way that makes a life possible. When I fell in love with Isaiah, I thought it meant my love for you was false. I tortured myself with guilt, convinced that one heart could not hold 2 different kinds of caring without betraying both. Now I know better. Love is not pie, Samuel. It doesn't get smaller when you slice it up. My love for Isaiah didn't diminish what I felt for you any more than loving your mother made you love me less. But knowing this and living with it are different things. The world has no place for women who love 2 men, even when both loves are honest and true. I could not be your wife and Isaiah's beloved without destroying us all. I could not choose between you without destroying myself. So I choose this, to leave you both with love intact, untainted by scandal, or betrayal or the compromises that would have poisoned everything beautiful we built together. Let your memory of me remain clean, Samuel. Let Isaiah remember kindness instead of shame. Let my death serve the love I could not serve in life. I am not asking you to forgive me. I am asking you to understand that this is my gift to both of you. Love preserved, honor intact, hearts free to heal and hope and maybe, someday to love again without the shadow of what we did to each other. Take care of yourself, my dear husband. Find someone who can love you the way you deserve, completely, without reservation, without the complications I brought to your life. You have earned that kind of peace. All my love, always and entirely yours. Eleanor. Samuel read the letter twice, then folded it carefully, and slipped it into his pocket beside his grandfather's watch. After 5 years of questions and revelations, Eleanor had finally spoken to him directly about her choice, and her words carried a clarity that all the second-hand explanations had lacked. She wanted you to find happiness, Daniel said quietly. My father said that was her greatest wish, that you would heal from losing her and build something new. Samuel looked at Eleanor's headstone, weathered now by 5 Texas winters, and felt something shift inside his chest. All these years he'd been holding on to grief like a sacred duty, as if letting go of pain would somehow dishonor Eleanor's memory. But this letter, her final gift to him, was permission to live fully again. "Tell your father something for me," Samuel said. "Tell him Eleanor's wish came true. I'm not the same man I was when she died, but I'm a better one, stronger, more grateful for what I had, more open to what might come." Daniel smiled. "He'll be glad to hear that. He's worried about you all these years, you know. Felt responsible for the pain you carried. He helped me carry it when I couldn't bear it alone." Samuel replied. "Tell him I'm grateful for that too." They stood together in comfortable silence, watching the wind move through the wildflowers that carpeted the hillside. Somewhere in the distance, a meadowlark sang its liquid song, and the afternoon sun painted the landscape in shades of gold that reminded Samuel why Eleanor had loved this country. "There's one more thing," Daniel said eventually. "My father wanted you to have this." He held out a small wooden object, a child's top, carved from oak and painted in bright colors. He made it for the baby he thought Eleanor was carrying. After he learned the truth, he couldn't bring himself to throw it away. He's been carrying it ever since, like a talisman. Samuel took the top, feeling its weight and smoothness, the care that had gone into its making. Isaiah had carved this for a child who'd never existed, had poured his hopes for the future into wood and paint and paternal love that had no object to receive it. "I'll treasure it," Samuel said. "And Daniel, when your father passes, I want you to know there's always a place for you here. If you need work or just want to see where your father and Eleanor found each other, your family, in the way that matters." Daniel's eyes brightened with unshed tears. "Thank you, Mr. That means more than you know." As the young man prepared to leave, Samuel found himself thinking about the strange journey that had brought them together, how loss and love, and the complicated choices people make had woven their lives into a pattern he never could have imagined. Eleanor's death had introduced him to Isaiah Freeman, whose love for her had taught Samuel new ways to grieve and forgive. Isaiah's life had produced Daniel, who would carry forward his father's work and honor Eleanor's memory in schools and classrooms and young minds hungry for knowledge. It was a legacy Eleanor never could have planned, but one that honored everything she'd valued: education, compassion, the belief that people could transcend the circumstances of their birth if given the chance to learn and grow. After Daniel left, Samuel spent another hour at Eleanor's grave, reading her final letter one more time and thinking about the woman who'd loved him steadily for 29 years, and adventurously for one brief complicated season. He thought about Miss Patterson, whose gentle friendship had been slowly warming the corners of his life, and about the possibility that hearts could heal without forgetting, could love again without betraying what came before. When he finally mounted his horse to ride home, Samuel carried with him Eleanor's wooden top, her final letter, and the knowledge that her greatest gift to him hadn't been her death, it had been her permission to live fully in spite of it. The story that had begun with a black drifter helping a rancher bury his wife, was ending with understanding, forgiveness, and the quiet promise of new beginnings. Some stories end with justice, others end with love triumphant. The best ones, Samuel was learning, end with wisdom earned and grace received, with the knowledge that even the most complicated human hearts are capable of healing if given time and truth, and the courage to let go of what cannot be changed. As he rode down from Widow's Ridge through the gathering dusk, Samuel Hayes felt truly free for the first time in 5 years. Eleanor's story was finally completely told. Now it was time to begin writing his own. Behind him, wildflowers bloomed on Eleanor's grave, and somewhere in Kansas, children in the Eleanor Hayes Academy were learning to read by lamplight, carrying forward the legacy of a woman whose love had been too large for any one life to contain, but just right for the many lives it continued to touch. The end.